Hey everybody, it's your average jeweler again. Thank you for joining me. If you're here and you're thinking of buying an engagement ring, congratulations, because that is a big deal. It also means you've probably run into some more questions, one of them being, how do I decide what I'm supposed to spend on this thing? And you will get a ton of answers. Now, I've been on every side of this. I've been on the buying side when I didn't have a lot of jewelry experience. I've been on the selling side. I've been on the advisory side, helping friends. I can tell you there are a lot of things that go into this, and I feel pretty well versed on the topic, but we're gonna try and talk through it because I don't think it's as straightforward as some might lead you to believe, but I do think there's some principles that can help you. So let's talk about that. Something that I think can be obvious and yet not so obvious is we need to talk about what you make. And I know that seems silly, but I'm not just talking about the actual dollar amount you make. I think it's important to recognize you have to understand what's coming in and what's going out. Just because you make more than someone else doesn't necessarily mean you have more to put into something like an engagement ring. By many people's standards, an engagement ring is still a bit of a luxury, although it does represent something very important, and I think a lot of couples and women still appreciate the sentiment. That doesn't mean they all think you need to spend tons and tons of money. You don't have to drain every last bit of your life savings. However, if you go into it thinking, well, it's not worth any of my money, then sometimes that sends a message that what it represents isn't very important. I recognize that's not how everyone thinks, that's not how everyone feels, but there is something behind this item that's supposed to stay with you for hopefully your entire marriage, and getting something that's going to be sturdy enough to last a long time, that's going to be something that's a style that you're happy and comfortable wearing for a very long time. And then of course, there is some intrinsic value that's part of the representation fact. Some of those things might be important than others. I'm not here to push a higher budget on anybody. I do think that you should think through these things because sometimes we've come into it with a previous opinion and maybe we haven't spent enough time really processing why we feel how we feel about that purchase. So that's what I want to help with. With that said, I hear a lot of people coming in saying, well, it's supposed to be this percentage of your salary, or it's supposed to be this many months of your salary, whether it's a month's salary or 2 months salary or 3 months salary. I hear that term, and admittedly, for some people that actually works just fine, and it works well, and it makes a lot of sense for them. But it shouldn't be a generic rule across the board, and I'll tell you why. So, for the same reason that you have to go in and actually figure out what your budget looks like, you have to come into this not thinking of it as being a solid percentage figure, because someone with a relatively lower income is not necessarily going to be able to take a huge percentage of that income because they might be dealing with a budget where going into a given month, 90% of their income is spoken for on what would be almost necessities or primarily necessities, versus someone that has a higher income may have got themselves into a place where whether they've paid off some things in their past or they just generally have a higher salary to live off of, they're in a position where they could potentially use a higher percentage. And then you get into the much higher echelons of those that have plenty of wealth and they don't really have to deal with that budgeting equation nearly as much. You're not going to necessarily have them specifically dialed into a percentage or some type of monthly salary because it might not make sense for them. So I hope you're starting to see that it's not quite as simple as nailing it down to some type of a monthly salary. But if you're looking for a baseline and you do have that wiggle room in your budget, maybe it's not a bad idea to kind of earmark that as something that you want to set aside. Now, I hope that some of these things you've thought about before, because again, congratulations if you are someone considering this process and starting to go through it. I hope that you've already kind of started to consider some of those other budgetary things. And while on one side of the argument, I know some people will completely save as much as they can with the engagement ring and the wedding and all things related to building up to marriage, and they might say, well, I want to save it for the marriage. I can agree with many of those sentiments. However, not everyone's going to feel that way, and you do have to recognize if things are really that tight. I hope you've thought through all the questions of what it's going to look like when you are married, and whether you have your finances initially and immediately tied together or whether you're planning on keeping things separate. There's financial logistics to consider. So this is a good place to start because you want to be setting some good practices in place. You don't necessarily want to be saying, no, we can't have any luxuries whatsoever, and we're not going to do X and Y and Z, even if we enjoy them. But you also need to be aware that there's some very practical components to how you manage your money, and even more so when you're partnering with another individual. And for me, budgeting hits a few different levels, and I see it as a very important component. And for those planning on getting married, I think you should spend a lot of time trying to figure out what it's going to look like after you get married. And you might be able to use that as part of your budgeting process for buying an engagement ring. And you may even learn some things about yourself or your spouse. So while that little tidbit, it may not specifically be related to buying the ring, it is a tangent I feel is important. And I want to encourage anyone out there who's listening to try and get a hold of their finances and really take control of that so that they're not completely bogged down all the time, because that's an important thing to be able to do. Now I want to start wrapping things up with maybe some minimal expectations. And you've possibly heard me talking about this in some other videos, but I want to make sure you understand to get a quality of ring that most people are going to be happy with and that you're actually going to be able to have for years to come. Maybe you're someone who plans on replacing it. This might not be you I'm describing, but for a general audience who's thinking about something like an engagement ring and they plan on this being their engagement ring for many, many years, you want to plan on at least some minimal budget and have an expectation going into it that this is kind of your starting point, and then from there you can decide how much you can or would like to spend in addition to that, and maybe what you're getting for that additional cost. Because I'll take a slight rabbit trail here. There is such a thing as the law of diminishing returns, and something like a diamond is a great example. To get yourself into just a very basic diamond that's not known for having a lot of very clean internal aspects to it. Maybe it's a little bit dingier, but you're not noticing that right away. Maybe it has some inclusions, but you're not noticing that right away. You know, you can get yourself into a diamond of that quality, but every little tiny thing after that to move up in quality, you're going to see an exponential increase. And that all goes back to how much more rare it is to find diamonds of that quality. It's not that they don't have them, it's that how do they decide who gets the nicer one? Well, it's price. So in the same respect, there is going to be kind of a baseline, and then from there, expect to pay a good bit more for incremental increases as you get into nicer qualities or sizes. Those are all things that you can factor in when you start into the process. So, what is a good baseline price? I'm going to throw a few numbers out there and tell you what you might expect to see for these dollar amounts. Now, with where gold is at, and I do recommend gold versus something like silver, platinum is still a really good choice, but that's an even higher price point. So getting into something like an engagement ring, I'm typically going to say 14 karat gold, white gold especially. Those are really solid options. But it's gold, so there's a cost to it. Just to get into a decent quality mount that you might be putting some stones into, or even just a single solitaire, you know, you're going to want to plan on probably that $1,000 mark just to get yourself into a decent gold ring. Now, I know that you can have some less expensive stones, maybe you can use some diamond alternatives, and you can get a really simple mount for you might still find something for $400 or $500 that's a gold mount, but there's going to be some corners that are potentially getting cut on those things. And I see it a lot, specifically from a lot of online vendors, so you have to be careful who you're dealing with. Not all online vendors are bad, but they will notoriously make a ring much, much lighter because they know they can save themselves cost, and they also don't think that you'll notice the difference when you get it. In day-to-day practice, though, that means the wear on the ring is going to occur much more quickly. You're going to have less metal to wear through. You're going to have smaller and thinner things that can bend away more easily and break more easily. So I would think of kind of that $1,000 mark as being just kind of a bare minimum, in my opinion, for what a ring that's going to last a long, long time should be. Partly my opinion, and I know that it's a subjective topic, but I'm giving you something so you can go off of. Whether you decide on something else or not, totally up to you. Now, with that said, if you're wanting a genuine diamond and you want a gold engagement ring, I would say go into the process thinking maybe, a nice ring. Again, I'm talking about a nice ring. I'm not talking, as inexpensive as you can get. But if you give yourself a $3,000 to $5,000 budget, you're going to have some good options. You're going to actually find some things that you like. You're going to find some qualities that you like. You're going to find designs that you like. And you're not going to feel totally boxed in by either quality or choices. I think some of you out there might be listening and thinking, wow, I thought I was going to have to spend way more than that. Some of you are out there thinking, I'm never spending that much, period. And that's fine. From where I stand and from what I've seen, I know a lot of people come into the jewelry store and maybe they have $500, and right out of the gate they're kind of frustrated. And maybe they end up finding something they're happy with, but it's not very often going to be a long-term option. And then you have those that start to come in where they had $2,000 or $3,000 and they're looking at their options and they're seeing a few things that they kind of like even in the 2,000 range. But as soon as they start getting closer to 3,000, and those customers that came in where they planned on 5,000 or so, they're at least going to have plenty of options. They may not get everything they wanted, but they're going to have some really nice options. Now I'm moving on to kind of a third category, which is someone coming in where they want the typical quintessential engagement ring, and they really would like to break into a 1-carat stone for one reason or another. I would say you can do this for that $6,000-$7,000 range, but just be aware you might not get all the things you want, and you may not be getting the quality diamond you want. So either think about going into it with the mindset that you're going to plan on spending a bit more, maybe that 10,000 plus range, or kind of get in your mind, maybe you want to focus more on quality over quantity, and then you bring yourself back into having a lot of options. I've talked a lot today. I know some of this information is more opinion and subjective than normal, but hopefully it's helpful for you to process some of the things that might come up and at least brace yourself for whether you've been under planning or over planning, so that you can set some expectations and start having a general idea so you're not blindsided as you start to think about, what am I going to spend on this? If you have some friends out there that are thinking through this process, maybe you yourself are not buying an engagement ring, I hope you'll send them this video that I would think they would find helpful. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please let me know what pieces of information you thought were useful down in the comments section. And I hope you keep coming back so that we can keep learning together.